The summer air shimmered with gasoline and cut grass. Radios hummed from open windows, and chrome cars glided down quiet neighborhood streets, their steering wheels gleaming like silver in the sun. Fathers leaned out with one hand on the door, a cigarette in the other, while kids laughed from the back seat, untethered, bouncing on vinyl cushions. There were no helmets on bikes, no safety warnings on toys, and nobody thought twice about it. Life in the 1960s felt lighter, looser, like the whole country was exhaling after the long, anxious breath of war. It was a decade of trust. People believed in their neighbors, their cars, their lawns, and in the American dream that stretched just beyond the picket fence. The rules were simple, unspoken, and fewer. You didn't need a warning label to tell you not to touch something hot. You didn't need a government agency to remind you how to raise your children. Freedom wasn't an argument. It was the air itself, invisible but everywhere. It was the way kids roamed the streets until the streetlights flickered on, and parents didn't worry because the world still felt safe. Everywhere you looked, that confidence was reflected in the smiles on magazine covers, in the jingling keys of new Chevrolets, in the backyard barbecues where men flipped burgers barehanded and women carried platters of deviled eggs under the sun. Cigarette smoke curled through the air like part of the scenery. Ashtrays sat in every home, every diner, even beside the checkout counter at the grocery store. It was all so ordinary that no one thought to question it. The 1960s lived by its own rhythm. Saturday mornings smelled of coffee and newspaper ink. On the back seat to get a better view. Shag carpets, sometimes cartoons sponsored by Shillery cereals. The road. Sundays belonged to church, football, and family drives with no destination. It was a world running on trust and habit, less efficient, perhaps, but more human. The dangers were invisible, hidden beneath the shine of optimism. Lead paint on the walls, smoke in the lungs, but nobody saw it that way. Progress meant convenience, and convenience meant freedom. To live in that time was to feel endless possibilities. The moon was within reach, the suburbs were booming, and the future felt like something that could only get better. Yet under that golden light, there was a kind of blindness to a belief that what felt normal must be right. People didn't yet know what they were trading away in exchange for all that comfort, all that ease. They were building a life that looked perfect on the outside, even if the cracks were already forming beneath the surface. It was an era of innocence and contradiction, beautiful, reckless, and unforgettable. The laughter, the noise, the carelessness, it all felt so alive. But behind that carefree lifestyle were things so normal, and you wouldn't believe they were crimes now. The highway shimmered like a silver ribbon under the summer sun, and the car was its own little world. Dad had one hand on the wheel and the other hanging out the window, tapping along to the radio. Mom leaned over the seat, passing sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, while the kids rolled around in the back like puppies, shouting over the roar of the wind. There were no seatbelts, no car seats, no child locks, just vinyl seats that stuck to bare legs and the smell of gasoline and bubble gum. Somehow, it all felt perfectly safe. That was family travel in 1960s America. Nobody thought twice about it. Kids stood on the back seat to get a better view, sometimes even leaning between the front seats to watch the road. Infants rode in their mothers' arms, and toddlers climbed from seat to seat as the car cruised down long, empty highways. It wasn't neglect, it was normal. The idea of safety first hadn't arrived yet, and freedom behind the wheel mattered more than anything else. Car commercials of the time showed smiling families without a single seatbelt in sight. The father drove one-handed, a confident grin on his face, while his wife turned to the children in the back seat, all laughter and motion. Freedom wasn't just a selling point, it was a way of life. The car represented independence, a rolling symbol of American optimism. The open road wasn't something to fear. It was something to conquer. Nobody wanted to be told how to drive or how to live. It's strange to think about now, But seatbelts weren't required in new cars until the late 1960s, and even then, most people didn't use them. Some drivers tucked them under the seats because they got in the way. Others cut them out entirely. Many Americans saw safety laws as unnecessary interference, a suggestion, not a rule. If you were careful, if you were a good driver, you didn't need one. That confidence was woven into the culture. People trusted themselves more than they trusted the law. Of course, the world looked different from the driver's seat then. Cars were tanks of steel, not computers on wheels. The hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of tires on the road felt like control, like certainty. But that illusion of safety came with a cost. The accidents, the injuries, they happened, but people didn't talk about them the way they do now. It wasn't until the late 1960s, when seatbelt campaigns and crash data began to surface, that America started to realize how fragile that freedom had been. Still, for those who remember, there's something bittersweet about it all. The danger was real, but so was the joy. The smell of a new car, the laughter echoing through the back seat, the feeling of endless highway stretching ahead. It was freedom in its purest form, before anyone thought to measure it. And if cars were wild, the skies weren't much better. The moment you stepped onto a plane in the 1960s, the first thing you noticed wasn't the hum of the engines. It was the smoke. A soft blue haze drifted through the cabin like part of the atmosphere, curling around the overhead lights as passengers settled into their seats. Ashtrays were built into the armrests, and the scent of tobacco mingled with the faint tang of jet fuel. Flight attendants, dressed in crisp uniforms and bright smiles, offered cigarettes along with coffee and cocktails. The smoke in the air wasn't rude, it was glamorous. It meant you had arrived. Back on the ground, the haze was everywhere. Doctors smoked in their offices between appointments. Teachers puffed in the teacher's lounge, their laughter spilling out into hallways filled with the faint scent of Lucky Strikes. Hospitals had designated smoking rooms where visitors could light up while waiting for news. Even children's cartoons sometimes showed characters with cigarettes dangling from their lips. Smoke wasn't a vice, it was a part of life, a symbol of adulthood, sophistication, and control. Cigarette ads plastered highways and magazines. Movie stars posed with glowing tips between their fingers, their expressions confident, seductive, untouchable. Athletes endorsed brands that promised strength and stamina, while doctors appeared in white coats to assure Americans that their favorite cigarette was the healthy choice. It was a marketing empire built on reassurance, convincing millions that nothing could be more natural than inhaling cool menthol air on a sunny afternoon. At home, the ritual was the same. After dinner, someone would strike a match, the flame catching in the dim light. Cigarettes were passed around like dessert. The flick of a lighter punctuated conversations, and the smoke lingered long after guests had gone. Ashtrays sat on coffee tables beside magazines and candy dishes. It wasn't about addiction. It was about belonging. To smoke was to fit in. Even as early warnings began to appear, reports hinting at links to cancer and heart disease were easy to dismiss. The evidence felt abstract, far away from the daily comfort of a cigarette after a long day. Smoking was so deeply woven into the fabric of American life that questioning it felt like questioning the culture itself. People trusted what they saw: happy faces in ads, healthy bodies on billboards, and a government that didn't yet say no. It wasn't until the 1970s that the air started to clear, both literally and figuratively. Anti-smoking campaigns slowly replaced glossy ads. Warning labels appeared on packs. The haze that once symbolized confidence began to look like a mistake no one wanted to admit making. But for those who lived through it, the memory remains strangely beautiful. The glow of a cigarette in a dimly lit diner, the curl of smoke against a jukebox light, the innocence of a time before the truth became undeniable. But while smoke filled the skies, something even stranger was happening on the streets. There was a time when a cold beer in the front seat didn't raise an eyebrow. The driver's arm rested casually on the open window, a bottle balanced between his fingers as the radio hummed and the road stretched endlessly ahead. Maybe a cooler sat in the back seat, filled with more for later. Nobody thought twice about it. Not the passengers, not the families passing by, not even the police. In 1960s America, the phrase drinks to go didn't mean iced coffee or soda. It meant exactly what it sounded like. Open container laws barely existed, and in many states, drinking while driving wasn't technically illegal unless you were visibly drunk. Officers might have pulled someone over for speeding or a broken light, but if the driver seemed steady and polite, the half-empty beer went unnoticed. It wasn't neglect. It was normal. Alcohol was part of the culture, woven into weekend drives, family picnics, and late-night conversations on the front porch. Beer commercials made it look wholesome. Handsome fathers grilled burgers with a can of Budweiser in hand while wives smiled approvingly and kids ran through sprinklers nearby. Whiskey had its promised class, confidence, and camaraderie. Liquor wasn't portrayed as danger. It was the essence of the good life. To drink was to be American, free, and sociable. Even the phrase "one for the road" carried a friendly tone, a casual wink to what would later be recognized as deadly. Inside cars, the sound of a bottle cap popping open blended with the chatter of the AM radio and the rush of wind. It was comfort, routine, and trust rolled into one. The idea that this could be reckless simply hadn't entered public consciousness. Drinking was part of adulthood, something everyone assumed you could handle responsibly. Accidents happened, of course, but they were blamed on bad luck or poor weather, rarely on the beer in the driver's hand. Statistics from that era tell a different story. Fatal crashes involving alcohol were shockingly common, yet the connection between drinking and driving wasn't treated as a moral or legal issue. Society hadn't drawn the line yet. It wasn't until the 1980s, decades later, that groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD, would push for nationwide reform. Before that, freedom on the road meant freedom to make your own mistakes. Looking back, it is almost impossible to imagine a time when the family car could double as a mobile bar, when coolers clinked behind the seats, and no one felt unsafe. Yet, in its own way, it reflected how America saw itself then: responsible, self-reliant, and immune to consequence. Laws were light because trust was heavy. But that trust came with a price, paid quietly over years of crashes and losses that could no longer be ignored. The open road had been too open for too long. And just like driving, parenting had its own version of no rules. The sound of laughter carried through the long summer evenings, bouncing off houses and echoing down empty streets. Barefoot kids rode bikes with no helmets, racing each other until the streetlights flickered on. They built makeshift ramps out of plywood and cinder blocks, scraped their knees, wiped off the blood, and kept going. Parents didn't hover. They watched from the porch or didn't watch at all. The world felt safe enough. You told your mom you were going outside, and she didn't ask where. She just said, "Be home by dinner." In 1960s America, childhood was a test of courage wrapped in freedom. Safety rules were few, and most of them were unwritten. Seatbelts were optional, helmets were unheard of, and playgrounds looked more like obstacle courses from a survival show. Steel monkey bars burned under the sun, concrete surrounded the swings, and merry-go-rounds spun faster than any adult could tolerate. Kids learned balance, endurance, and consequence the old-fashioned way by falling hard and getting up again. The toys weren't much safer. Lawn darts with metal tips sailed through backyards, chemistry sets hissed and smoked on kitchen tables, and firecrackers exploded under the curious hands of children who never read warning labels because there weren't any. Those toys were thrilling, dangerous, and unforgettable. A scraped elbow or a burned fingertip wasn't a tragedy. It was part of growing up. Every scar came with a story, and every story was proof that you'd lived a little. Parents saw it differently then. They believed in toughening kids up, not wrapping them in bubble wrap. A few bumps, a few scares were lessons in self-reliance. Adults trusted their children, and maybe more importantly, trusted the world around them. Neighbors kept an eye out, teachers ruled with authority, and the community itself felt like one big safety net. Children were freer because parents didn't believe danger was lurking behind every door. It's easy now to see the risks in that freedom. The accidents, the near misses, the blind faith that nothing bad would happen. But there's also something beautiful in the memory of it. That unshakable sense of adventure. The independence learned through scraped knees and skinned palms. The thrill of riding down a hill with no brakes and all the confidence in the world. Childhood then was wild, imperfect, and full of lessons you couldn't learn from a screen or a seatbelt. Looking back, it's hard not to smile at how simple it all seemed. Parents weren't careless. They just lived in a time that felt safe enough to let go. The line between freedom and recklessness was thinner then, but it was also what made growing up so rich and vivid. Those kids carried that freedom into adulthood, the sense that life was to be lived, not padded. And while kids were wild outside, things inside the home weren't exactly safe either. The 1960s promised a bright, modern America, sleek, efficient, and filled with the wonders of new technology. But beneath that glossy optimism was a quiet danger seeping into nearly every home. The walls, the toys, even the air, everything carried a trace of poison that no one thought twice about. It wasn't evil. It was ignorance. These were the modern materials that made life convenient until we learned what they really did to us. Lead was everywhere. In paint, it gave walls that smooth, durable finish that mothers loved and children touched. In gasoline, it kept engines running smoothly while spewing invisible toxins into the air. Kids chewed on windowsills coated in lead-based paint. Families breathed in its dust every day. Yet for decades, the warnings were dismissed as overreactions. It wasn't until the late 1970s that the truth broke through that the miracle metal was silently damaging generations. Asbestos was another invisible killer woven into ceilings, pipes, and even floor tiles. It was strong, fireproof, and cheap, the miracle insulation of the atomic age. Schools, offices, and homes were lined with it. Workers handled it barehanded, breathing in the tiny fibers that would scar their lungs years later. Nobody imagined that something so useful, so widespread, could also be deadly. It took decades and countless lives for the danger to be taken seriously. Then there were the everyday chemicals that touched nearly everything. Teflon-coated pans promised effortless cooking. DDT was sprayed across crops, lawns, and even children, hailed as the miracle insect killer. Industrial chemicals filled rivers and air with progress. Television commercials sold it all with smiles and slogans. Better living through chemistry. And for a while everyone believed it. But a few voices refused to stay silent. Scientists like Rachel Carson began to warn that the price of convenience was too high. Her 1962 book Silent Spring shook the nation, exposing how DDT and other chemicals were poisoning wildlife and people. It was one of the first times America looked at its shiny new world and realized the cracks beneath the polish. Slowly, painfully, environmental awareness began to take root. By the end of the decade, whispers had become action. Lead phased out of paint. Environmental agencies formed. Laws were written to protect what once seemed indestructible: the air, the water, the human body. But for millions who grew up in that era, the damage had already been done. It's almost unbelievable now, thinking how normal it was for children playing on asbestos floors, breathing lead dust, eating from Teflon-coated pans. It wasn't carelessness. It was faith in progress, the belief that science would never harm the people it served. The 1960s were a time of wonder, but also of naivety. A nation in love with invention, unaware that some of its brightest creations were quietly killing it. And even the food on the table came with its own hidden dangers. The 1960s kitchen was a laboratory of convenience, color, and confidence. Dinner didn't come from a stove, it came from a freezer. Moms in aprons slid shiny aluminum trays into ovens, and in 20 minutes, a full roast turkey dinner was ready, complete with mashed potatoes that came out of a packet and peas that tasted faintly of tin. It was the future served on a TV tray. Nobody worried about calories or chemicals. The goal wasn't health, it was ease. Families gathered around television sets, balancing foil trays on their laps, watching the Ed Sullivan Show or Bonanza. The soft buzz of the TV filled the room while the smell of processed gravy and instant mashed potatoes hung in the air. The idea of homemade was changing fast. Convenience wasn't just practical, it was patriotic. America had conquered space and science, so surely it could conquer dinner too. But those shiny meals came with ingredients that would never pass today's safety tests. Artificial dyes that made Jell-O glow like stained glass. Preservatives with names no one could pronounce. Trans fats are hidden in nearly everything. Parents didn't think twice about it. If it was on the shelf, it had to be safe. The FDA's oversight was limited, and food companies had free rein to experiment. Flavor came first, nutrition last. And then there were the kids. Breakfast was a sugar parade of rainbow cereals, chocolate milk, and marshmallow bits. Cartoon mascots danced across TV screens, shouting promises of energy and fun. Few realized that these ads were building lifelong habits, hooking a generation on sweetness. Soda wasn't a treat. It was part of childhood. Glass bottles clinked in lunchboxes, and nobody counted the teaspoons of sugar they held. Still, there was something undeniably comforting about those meals. The scent of buttered corn, the sparkle of a glass Coca-Cola, the laughter around the dinner table. Processed though it was, it felt like family, like progress, like America moving forward. People weren't chasing health, they were chasing time, and time was precious in a world speeding toward the future. By the late 1960s, though, the cracks began to show. Reports surfaced linking food dyes to hyperactivity, preservatives to health issues, and sugar to rising obesity. Slowly, the carefree eating habits of the post-war years started to lose their glow. Nutrition labels appeared. Scientists replaced advertisers as the new voices of authority. The age of trust gave way to the age of awareness. Looking back now, it is easy to laugh at gelatin molds filled with canned fruit or mayonnaise salads that shimmered in pastel colors. But they tell a story of optimism, the belief that technology could make life perfect, right down to the dinner plate. The meals of the 1960s fed more than just hunger. They fed a dream of modern life. It's a dream we've since traded for caution, ingredients lists, and calorie counts. Yet part of us still misses that simpler flavor, the one that came wrapped in foil, bright and naive, tasting of the American dream. But it wasn't just about what Americans ate. It was also about what they were allowed to say and do. Turn on a TV in 1960s America, and you'd step into a world that feels almost unrecognizable today. Housewives smiled as their husbands lectured them in commercials. Comedians made jokes that now sting. And cartoon mascots echoed stereotypes that would be banned before they ever made it to air. It was an age of jingles, charm, and unfiltered humor when the lines between fun and offense were wide, blurry, and often invisible. A single magazine page said it all. A man towering over a woman with the headline, "Show her it's a man's world." Ads like that filled Life and the Saturday Evening Post, selling everything from coffee to cars. Women were homemakers, smiling through absurdity, their worth measured in spotless floors and hot dinners. It wasn't cruelty, it was the norm, reinforced by laughter and applause. Sitcoms like The Honeymooners and I Dream of Jeannie built entire plots around gender roles that now seem like relics from another planet. And race? It was barely part of the story. TV screens showed an America that was overwhelmingly white, even as the civil rights movement unfolded outside. Black characters were rare, often stereotypes when they appeared. Native Americans, Asians, and Latinos were written through caricature or not at all. In cartoons, in commercials, in the scripts of late-night talk shows, the jokes came easy and the awareness came slow. Even the ads that weren't directly offensive carried a message that feels unsettling now. Cigarettes equaled confidence. Beer equaled manhood. A handsome actor would light up and smile at the camera, his suit crisp, his hair perfect, saying things like, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other brand." The unspoken lesson was clear. Success meant control, and control meant vice: smoke, drink, smile, repeat. But it wasn't all malice. Much of it came from a place of innocent people repeating what culture taught them, unaware of the damage it caused. What we see as shocking now was simply invisible then. Society hadn't yet learned the language of equality, inclusion, or empathy. The mirror was fogged, and everyone thought they saw themselves clearly. By the 1970s and beyond, that fog began to lift. Feminism reshaped advertising. Diversity pushed its way onto screens. The jokes that once drew laughter began to draw silence. America started to see itself not as it imagined, but as it truly was. And though nostalgia makes those old jingles and black and white sitcoms feel warm and familiar, they also remind us how much had to change for progress to happen. It's tempting to remember the 1960s as a golden age of simplicity. But culture is a mirror, and those reflections weren't kind to everyone. What we've lost in innocence, we've gained in awareness, and maybe that's the trade every generation has to make. But the 1960s weren't just loose with laws. They were bold with experimentation, too. In the 1960s, science was both magic and menace, a dazzling new frontier where almost anything seemed possible, and almost nothing was off-limits. Families gathered on rooftops to watch the horizon flash from nuclear tests, the sky glowing faintly orange, as if the future itself was being born. The announcers on TV called it progress. The crowds clapped. No one talked about fallout, or the dust that would drift quietly into lungs and soil miles away. It was an age when curiosity outran caution. Factories experimented with chemicals they barely understood. Laboratories tested miracle drugs on volunteers who never truly knew what they were signing up for. The word regulation felt like a dirty one, something that got in the way of discovery. And in those days, discovery was sacred. One of the most haunting examples was thalidomide, a sedative prescribed to pregnant women for morning sickness. It was marketed as safe modern medicine's gentle touch. Then came the children born with missing limbs and severe deformities. By the time the world realized what had happened, thousands of lives were changed forever. It was a tragedy born not of cruelty, but of unchecked faith in progress. The same spirit touched every corner of the decade. Doctors advertised miracle diets with dangerous drugs. Scientists sprayed DT on crops and playgrounds. The government ran psychological and radiation experiments on unsuspecting citizens, convinced that the ends justified the means. Progress wasn't questioned. It was worshipped. And to question, it was to seem un-American. Yet, for all its recklessness, that era also built the framework for the safeguards we live with today. Public outrage over failed trials, pollution, and exposure led to new laws. The Clean Air Act, the formation of the EPA, and the FDA's stricter oversight. The pendulum swung from blind ambition to accountability, from can we to should we? Looking back, the 1960s feel like a paradox, a time of incredible innovation shadowed by moral blind spots. The same decade that dreamed of reaching the moon also filled the earth with toxic smoke. It taught humanity a harsh but necessary truth, that science without limits isn't progress. It's a gamble. But maybe that's why the story still matters. Every vaccine, every clean water law, every ethical code written since then carries the fingerprints of that chaotic, fearless decade. The mistakes of the 1960s became the warnings that shaped our modern world. And through it all, one lesson keeps echoing through time. Freedom in the 1960s was more than a word. It was a way of breathing. You could smoke in an airplane, drive without a seatbelt, and let your kids disappear until sunset without a flicker of worry. Life moved slower, rules were lighter, and trust ran deep. It was messy, beautiful, and dangerously simple. People believed in personal responsibility, not warning labels. They believed that life was meant to be lived, not managed. But that same freedom came with a quiet cost. The open roads that symbolized independence also hid tragedy in every curve. The cigarettes that filled movie screens with elegance filled hospitals with heartbreak. The easy confidence of progress blinded a nation to the poisons in its homes and the biases in its culture. For every memory that glows warm with nostalgia, there's another that reminds us just how fragile that era really was. And yet, the innocence of the 1960s gave America its soul. It was a country still learning, still believing that everything could be better tomorrow. Mistakes weren't made out of malice. They were born from optimism, from a time when people thought science could only help, when laughter on TV meant unity, and when no one imagined how quickly the world could change. There's something achingly human about a generation trying to do its best, without realizing the cracks forming beneath its feet. Today, we live surrounded by warnings, labels, and rules. We've traded a bit of that reckless freedom for safety, and most days, that feels like progress. Cars save lives. Homes are cleaner. Medicine heals instead of harms. We know more, and we see further. But sometimes, when people look back at the chrome cars, the neon diners, the smell of fresh-cut grass on a summer evening, they're not longing for the danger. They're longing for the feeling of trust, of simplicity, of being unafraid to live. That is the bittersweet truth of the 1960s. It gave us both the dream and the wake-up call. The era that taught us freedom also taught us responsibility. Its mistakes became our lessons. Its risks built our safeguards. Its beauty still lingers in our memories, even as its dangers remind us why things had to change. Because history isn't about judging the past, it is about remembering how far we've come.